Miss Kerry Howard, who is the teacher of sociology, Caribbean studies, history, and I cannot read my writing, and I apologize, but one other subject. And Alicia Bourne, who teaches law and social studies. So the students are accompanied by their teachers, and we are very, very pleased to have all of you. And with that, minutes, please. We have the minutes of the meeting held on the 27th of September 2024, which are now to be confirmed.
Madam President, I beg to move the confirmation of the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, the 27th of September, 2024.
Confirmed. Presentation of petitions. No. No, we passed, President. The question is that the minutes of September 27th, 2024 be now confirmed. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Minutes are confirmed. Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm going to have to get adjusted to saying Madam President today. But before I get into the presentation of papers, I, of course, want to welcome the St. Michael's School and our guests today, along with Senator Nichols, who we are both alumni of the St. Michael's School. So I just spent the last 30 minutes with you, and I'm very happy to welcome you into the chamber. But the president of the chamber has done what many of us could not have done and has given an insight that is more than fitting. So to the documents to be laid, I am commanded to lay the following documents: the Barbados Medium-Term Fiscal Framework 2025 to 2026 and 2027 to 2028, the report on the St. George North by-election of 2020, the annual reports and audited financial statements of Hotel and Resorts Limited for the year ending March 31st, 2023, the ILO Convention, International Labour Organization Convention 160, Labour Statistics 1985, number 160, and Associated Recommendation R170, Statistics 1985, number 170. The 2023-2028 National Policy for Improving the Lives of Persons with Disabilities. The International Labour Organization Convention 149, let me just repeat that again for clarity. The International Labour Organization Convention 149, Nursing Personnel 1977, number 149, and respective recommendation R157, Nursing Personnel 1977, number 157. And finally, the 2023 report of the National Advisory Committee to guide the establishment of the Commission for Improving the Lives of Persons with Disabilities.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by minister.
Thank you, Madam President. I beg to move two items. One, the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 in the first instance, and also I will come back to the second matter at a little later date. But 45-2, the Standing Order to be suspended for the remainder of today's session.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be now suspended for the rest of the day. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The second item, Madam President, is to move the appointment of a deputy president for the remainder of today's sitting, and I beg to move the nomination of Senator the Honorable Lindell Nurse.
The question is that Senator the Honourable Lindell Nurse do serve as acting deputy president for the remainder of today's sitting. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Introduction of bills.
Madam President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills. I beg to move the first reading of the Merchant Shipping Bill 2024, the first reading of the Merchant Shipping Liability and Compensation Bill 2024, also the first reading of the Merchant Shipper Liner Conference 2024, the first reading of the Merchant Shipping Multimodal Transport Bill 2024, the first reading of the Maritime Marriage Bill, the first reading of the Business Barbados Bill 2024, and finally the first reading of the Human Tissue Transplant Bill 2024.
Question.
The question is that these bills do now be read a first time. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Public business. Madam Acting President, first item, public business today, I'm advised is order number 11, standing in name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate to move the second reading of the Business Barbados Bill 2024.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I promise that I'm apologizing upfront because I am certain that I'm going to slip today several times after 6 years of saying Mr. President, and I may have to correct myself, so I beg forgiveness upfront. but it is my honor to be able to say Madam President.
I forgive you for slipping. I thank you for your congratulations. Just don't say he.
Madam President, today I rise to introduce this bill, Order Number 11, on the order paper. But in so doing, Mr. President, as we start, in so doing, Madam President, I'm going to go through the legislation, yes, but if you look at the legislation, it's largely, for the most part, a benign piece of paper because it sets out the basic corporate structure. What is perhaps more important is what the legislation is intended to correct in terms of public policy, but perhaps what the legislation intends to set out in terms of public policy, and then secondly, what the legislation intends to correct in terms of the public mischief. And I also intend, Mr. President, to be able to connect the legislation in its benign form and in its corporate structure form with the operations of government and how it interfaces with the people of Barbados at all levels. Now, Madam President, this legislation creates a step change. It is a transformational process that really is not reflected even slightly in the legislation that is before us, quite frankly. If I were to go through the legislation section by section, which I will do now before I get into the details, because everything that I do will be contextually rooted in the legislation itself. First of all, in Part 2 of the legislation, it speaks about the establishment of Business Barbados, what its functions are, the establishment of a board, and it goes on to cover a range of things from sections 5 all the way through 20. I am going to share on the legislation, Madam President, what we're hoping to be able to accomplish legislatively first. First of all, this is a piece of legislation that subsumes an entity called CIPO, the Corporate Affairs and Intellectual Property Office of Barbados, within the umbrella of a brand new entity. CIPO is not being repurposed. CIPO is not being rebranded. CIPO is not becoming Business Barbados. CIPO and its functions, including the 33 pieces of legislation that are covered by CIPO, will be subsumed within this entity called Business Barbados, and the functions of Business Barbados will be far more expansive than those that currently exist under the Corporate Affairs and Intellectual Property Office. Now, first of all, CIPO as it exists has quasi-judicial responsibilities. The registrar with responsibility for CIPO has a quasi-judicial function. That quasi-judicial function has been preserved in this legislation. And as you go through the legislation, you will see things like the registrar, but it doesn't even speak to the registrar anymore. It identifies the director of IP, director of companies, which now becomes a title of registrar, being exempt from being directed or reporting to the board or the CEO. That is because of that quasi-judicial function, as I mentioned before, being preserved. This is not an ordinary CEO. This is not an ordinary senior level official. If you have a difficulty with any of the rulings of an ordinary director in an ordinary company, you go above them. You go to the CEO. You go to their supervisor. In some instances in Barbados, all roads, they say, lead to the Prime Minister, as the nature of the country that we live in, and all roads lead to a minister. But in a quasi-judicial body, if you have a difficulty with a ruling of the registrar as it is currently captured in the CIPO legislation under the rights and powers attributed to the registrar, and those rights have been transferred over to Business Barbados, your recourse is not to the CEO. Your recourse is not to the chairman of the board. Your recourse is to the court, because CIPO and Business Barbados, who will absorb their functions, is a quasi-judicial body. That's the first thing that I want to outline. It now allows for the legislative framework to couch those functions within that quasi-judicial framing. Now, it allows the body, the entity, to take into account not just the Companies Act. The Companies Act at Cap 308 is one piece of legislation, but there are 33 pieces of legislation, both directly and indirectly, which fall under the administration of this office. Let me start there on that piece of work by saying this. Many of the pieces of legislation, Madam President, as you would know as an attorney and those who are attorneys in here, are dated. Many of them have existed for a long time. Many of them have been edited over time, through this chamber and the other place over time. And we don't have, for example, in any single place, a single consolidated text of, say, for example, even the Companies Act, which is one of the principal pieces of legislation governing the work of CIPO and soon to be the work of Business Barbados. What we have is an amalgamation of multiple amendments over multiple years, over maybe 30 years of a piece of legislation. So the question Barbados is now asking itself is, are these 30 pieces of legislation, is the Companies Act and all of the functions, the public policy functions captured in this legislation still fit for purpose in 2024? And it is our judgment that perhaps in some instances it is not. And so one of the first things that you can expect Business Barbados to do, and we have already started the process internal to the ministry, is the constitution of a legislative team that will be assigned the responsibility to look at all of those pieces of legislation, including the Companies Act, and to be in a position to bring them into a 2025 context and to make them fit for purpose. What are some of the things that 30 years ago you were trying to correct as the public mischief that no longer are relevant in 2024? What are some of the things that you were attempting to correct for, or some of the processes that you were attempting to integrate that no longer are relevant in a modern context? That legislative work is about to begin comprehensively once we establish the entity in the creation of a legislative committee. That legislative committee, Madam President, is going to be chaired by a lead attorney who is going to take lead responsibility for shepherding the process through. They will have the benefit also of a policy advisor who will take responsibility for ensuring that the public policy is connecting with first the drafting of the legislative intent, and then it will have a legislative drafter who is going to be working closely along with the Chief Parliamentary Counsel for the purpose of drafting the amendments and, in some instances, new legislation. So this is a comprehensive body of work, and it's not a knee-jerk reaction to anything, and we have an internal conversation around this. It's not putting lipstick on a pig. So we're not trying to repurpose an old structure and encase it in new branding and present it to the public as something new. That's not what is happening here. Equally, Mr. President, Madam President, we have also begun to look at the processes being used in this entity. Madam President, I think I've said it here before, and I'll take the opportunity to say it here again. This month represents 2 years that I've sat in this ministry, 2 years. And in the first 2 weeks that I joined this ministry, when my phone started to go off, when people learned that I was coming over to this ministry, having come from the business support organization community in a previous life, 9 out of 10 calls were about CIPO. Lawyers, corporate trust service providers, accountants, all raising issues about having to deal with CIPO. I need to register a business and it takes too long. I need to be able to issue and submit a change of directors form. I can do this in Turks and Caicos in an hour, and in Barbados it's taking me months. Why is this necessary? These are the calls that I received in the first couple of days of transferring into this ministry. And they continued, perhaps not so aggressively over time as people became more and more immersed in the transformation that we started about a year ago, but they continued. There's not a business person in this country that has not had negative experiences with KIPO, bar none. I don't know of any. And I spend a lot of time immersed in the organizations that represent the business community. I spend a lot of time with the Barbados International Business Association. I spend a lot of time with the Barbados Chamber of Commerce. I spend a lot of time with the Barbados Manufacturers Association, the Small Business Association, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Barbados. I'm not guessing at this. This is direct feedback coming from every single business support organization, the Bar Association included, that they have had these problems. And so what have we done, Mr. President, Madam President? What have we done? The first thing we started to do, Madam President, was to look at where the historical evolution of this issue started. KIPO was set up in 2013. The KIPO went to its present offices in 2013. Then you had a suite of additional obligations being transferred over to this entity that we call KIPO, but we ain't had the bodies to do the work. We added greater responsibilities in 2013, and then again in 2016, but we never added bodies. So 2013, 2016, you have Financial Action Task Force obligations coming as a result of our anti-money laundering requirements. You have Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, obligations coming as a consequence of our international tax obligations and our reporting obligations. You have all kinds of mechanisms that are being required of us in terms of managing the beneficial ownership structure, the ultimate beneficial ownership structure, anti-money laundering and illicit proceeds of crimes, ensuring compliance, economic substance requirements. In some instances, Madam President, you would be surprised to know that one of the things that captures the attention of the international entities, the international regulatory entities, is the small business registration and the nonprofit community registration, because globally, they have been seen as the key and the center in a lot of instances to things related to illicit enrichment and money laundering activities. So sometimes the oversight has nothing to do with an individual standing in front of a business person wanting to be difficult, but it comes with us implementing global standards of compliance for the country. We even had a scenario, Madam President, where a year ago, as we were navigating dealing with the Financial Action Task Force under the leadership of the Office of the Attorney General, when we first came to office, there were perhaps 54 items that Barbados needed to comply with in order to get off of a gray list. By the time Barbados had put in the work over several years to be able to whittle those things down, there were one or two items remaining. One of those issues was the application of sanctions. Who knew, Madam President, that in trying to make business easier to do for individuals as sole proprietors, that it would come back to bite us in a different way? So I decide I want to start a business, or someone decides they want to buy a piece of real estate and they want to set up a company in which they will purchase that real estate, and they don't want to purchase it in their own name. They no longer have to get a lawyer, Madam President, as you would know, to be able to do that. They can do it on their own, or in some instances, they do get a lawyer and they set up the company. But who would have told them that on an annual basis, if under a company, submit your annual returns, that you are out of compliance with the relevant international and local regulations governing business in this country? Who would have told them? The accountants, in some instances, found themselves outside of that because people are attempting to do it themselves without understanding the international frameworks for reporting under which we are bound. And so you may set up a company, and in some instances, people don't even know. They set up the company and don't look back at it for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And before you know it, you have racked up annual returns penalties for multiple years. And while we wanted to attempt to support that, here came the challenge. Remember, I started out by saying that there were 54 items that the FATF began working through between 2013, 2016 and onward that we were non-compliant with. One of those issues that when we started navigating it in 2020 and one of the earlier meetings in 2021, 22 in particular, was sanctions. If you were not compliant with global reporting requirements, those were the things that kept you on a gray list. If we were to write off the waivers, the sanctions that had been issued, that would have kept us on the gray list. So sometimes it isn't that government is being difficult or government doesn't want to facilitate. Government has to function in a global environment. And I think it's important for people to be educated about what is required, especially when you are treating to legislative obligations. And so what is Business Barbados going to do to address these things? It is not in the legislation, but I did say I'm going to make sure that legislation collides with the public policy. We recognize that this was an issue, because we spent the time immersed, as I've said, in all of the business support organizations. And even the business support organizations have expressed concern about how difficult it is, a lot of times, to be able to get individuals as sole proprietors to understand what is necessary. So, first, we created a transition committee. And the transition committee constituted the members of the business support organizations whose members are immersed in the business community and who are the loudest challengers of the issues. The transition committee included membership from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Barbados, and I want to commend them for their work. With the permission of Madam President, I want to commend the work of Ms. Lisa Padmore, who sat and represented ICAB as their interim executive director on that committee. I want to commend the Barbados Chamber of Commerce, initially represented by Ms. Misha Lobban-Clark, who is their executive director, and now represented by Ronelle. I never remember Ronelle's last name, it's hyphenated, but she has represented now the chamber. The Barbados International Business Association, represented by Executive Director Ms. Carmel Haynes, has sat on that committee. We have also had the Small Business Association Executive Director, Ms. Lynette Holder, sitting on that committee. And we have also taken the time, Madam President, to engage with individual captains of industry. And so we have had the benefit of the input, especially in the design phase, from Chairman of the Growth Council, Mr. Doddridge Miller. I want to recognize him for his constant guidance of this team, and former Chairman and member of the Growth Council, former Chairman of Invest Barbados and member of the Growth Council, Mr. John Williams, for always being willing to give inputs. And so we did not come up with this on our own. We understood that the business community who was interfacing with this system needed to be involved, and we brought them in, not at the end to tell them what we had done, but we brought them in from the design phase. We then also went further, Madam President, we went further. Prime Minister has this way of saying to those of us in Cabinet, who is coming to work every day to do these things? We then brought in a dedicated transition coordination team. We brought in, to chair that process, one of the persons who would have led, in not a small way either, the business transformation of one of our major companies here in the country, Ms. Nakisha Reed. She has led the team. Also a former member, a well-established professional, Ms. Lionel Aline Jones. She has been the deputy coordinator. I'm not going to call all the other names, but I mentioned them particularly as the lead. But in addition to that, Madam President, you will be very pleased, we brought on a lot of young, bright, open-minded people to be able to see this thing with new lenses. We didn't want to have, we had the transition team coordination of the BSOs. They were there. But you know, BSO, business support organizations. But young people have a different way of viewing things as opposed to sometimes persons who have a vested interest in making sure things go their way. So we had the vested interest there, of course, but we brought together a team of young, bright people. One of those persons came on board to do a complete business process reengineering. They undertook over 400 and almost 500 interviews with individual stakeholders, customer-focused approach, a customer-centric approach. We call it a customer-first approach. They spent time in the weeds, talking to people who were interacting with KIPO. They broke down all of the processes. There were over 447 processes under the legislation that I've referred to, and they broke down in a business process reengineering structure what those processes were. We brought in, Madam President, in addition to the business process reengineering team, a financial modeling team, because KIPO on its own generates in fees and charges around $7 million a year. We wanted to understand the financial structure around creating a new entity and ensuring that that entity was able to stand on its own through the revenue that it was generating. And so the financial modeling team came in, again, a young, bright male in this instance as well. We then brought in a branding team, not putting lipstick on a pig. We wanted to make sure that what we promised was what we delivered. And so they worked together with the team to be able to ensure that all of these things were coordinated. We then went further and we brought in, again, another male, a digital coordinator. And I'll spend a moment on the digital coordinator. So we looked at the technology platforms. So the way in which we deployed manpower 20 years ago, 2013 when the last earlier incarnate, when KIPO first moved to its current location, 2016 when it expanded a little bit further with no support, we wanted to understand, okay, so we're not just going to throw bodies or throw money at this thing. Let's understand how technology, artificial intelligence in particular, can then help us to be far more future forward. So we brought in a digital coordinator. We did, at the time, Madam President, a digital audit of our existing software, our corporate digital registry, which was launched in 2021. We looked at what that platform provided for. We looked at all the things that it was doing, all the things that it wasn't doing. And we have made recommendations on what needs to be the way going forward. So, Madam President, first, immersion with the business community who's interfacing with the system and who's representing businesses, but also, and I'll come to this in a minute, the business community who represents companies that are functioning in Barbados, but are equally functioning in competitor jurisdictions. And I'll spend a moment on that in a minute. Barbados does not exist in a world by itself, despite what some on the other side of the fence, or the political fence, would want us to believe. We don't live in a vacuum. We live in a global world, a global community, where things that happen outside of our borders influence what happens within them. We don't live in a vacuum, in a bubble, a make-believe blue and yellow bubble, that nothing that happens internally doesn't have anything to do with what happens externally. That's a false and a misleading concept. Barbados deserve better than that. So when Barbados structures a KIPO or Business Barbados for Barbados, we ain't ready. What we've had to do is to structure a Business Barbados relative to who our competitors are and who are attracting business in the same way we are. Turks and Caicos Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, St. Lucia, Bahamas. These are some of the competitors just regionally for Barbados to have business. Not to mention those that are global businesses in other jurisdictions like Canada. How many people know that the captive insurance industry, for example, is one of the things that Barbados has historically done really well on? How many people know that? How many people know that the captive insurance industry is one of the areas where Barbados has historically, I believe, been number 7? Now, we have a direct competitor with Alberta, Canada, and so we have to ensure that Barbados is always building institutions, structures, processes, legislation, and the overall policy framework with a view to who its competitors are. Business does not owe us anything. Companies don't have to come to Barbados because we say so. Companies can come to Barbados, they can go to St. Lucia, they can go to Bahamas, they can go to TCI, depending on what their business is. They can take their domicile wherever they want. we have to give them a compelling reason to come here. Once upon a time, that compelling reason used to be that we were a low-tax jurisdiction. Effective January 2024, as a consequence of global tax rules and the OECD Global Convergence Tax Policy, we have now had a shift globally in tax policy, and where the minimum tax globally under the OECD is set at 15%. So you're no longer having an effective tax rate in the same way 5.5% that you used to have. It's a global convergence tax rate. So if we're not competing on tax, low here versus higher there, if you're not competing on tax, what are you competing on? You're not competing just on sun, sea, and sand, right? Those are superfluous notions when it comes to business and their bottom line. So what are we competing on? We are competing on a range of things, including the fact that Barbados has to position itself as that place to do business of choice relative to any other jurisdiction in the world. And so what did we do? We did a competitor analysis. We looked at every other jurisdiction in the region and beyond. We now know who is competing for what segments of the business. We now know which aspects of global business are going to which jurisdiction. We can tell you in all of those processes that we have business process re-engineered, Madam President. We can tell you how long it takes to do every single one of those processes in every one of our competitive jurisdictions. We can tell you how much it costs in every one of those competitor jurisdictions. We can tell you that because we are positioning Barbados as that place to do business. So the creation of Business Barbados, the entity, now is going to absorb all of that work that we have been able to do as a team and then position Barbados globally to be able to attract business. We can't go after every segment. It's not possible. We can't compete on everything. Not possible. And I know that we always talk about things like picking winners, whether it's a good strategy or a bad strategy, but we got to pick some winners when it comes to this particular space. And so we have made determinations in collaboration, and we will be working very closely with Invest Barbados and with the Growth Council to be able to identify where Barbados needs to position itself for the purpose of attracting, retaining, and where businesses choose to go elsewhere, replacing business. And why is that important, Madam President? I want to spend a moment, I'm going to come back to the actual legislation, but I want to spend a moment. I want to connect this, Madam President, to our development conversation. We sit in the Senate, and I remember I had a university lecturer in public international law. I never forgot his words. His name was Professor Stephen Vassiani. And he said to me at the time, not to me, the class, that if you take each subject that you are doing in isolation and you don't treat to them as though they are a coherent part of your knowledge base, and that you are immersing yourself in a discipline, not just in a subject, but in a discipline, you will be at a disadvantage. And so I have always approached everything since that 18-year-old piece of advice with that in mind. I don't view things in compartments. I take things all together. So go with me for a moment to the estimates of expenditure for 2024, 2025. In the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the annual expenditure assigned to the Ministry of Health was $236,347,534. Let's round it off at $237 million. If we go to the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Education's allocation in the estimates of expenditure for 2024, and this is the ministry that gets the largest chunk historically across governments, without question, the largest chunk of the government's expenditure to education typically amounts, this last year, was $417,633,000. $315,778. Let's round that off then as $417 million. Where does government expenditure go? Healthcare, education, and everything else is a smaller share. Where does government's revenue come from? We talk about tourism. Tourism is there. The corporation tax take of the government of Barbados in the last financial year from corporation tax from global businesses in particular was $470 million. That is the entire budget of the Ministry of Education. It is half the budget of the Ministry of Health. And we need to have a conversation. I wish, I feel as if when I worked in the University of the West Indies, we used to have a conversation, and I'm going to have the conversation. I would say it here now. When I used to work for the University of the West Indies I used to head their commercial arm, I used to say, I wish that we would send invoices to students. And we would say to students, the government of Barbados has paid X amount for you. This is what you have gotten in return. A few months ago, I was in Golden Square. I was attending a Rotary event. Everybody knows I'm a Rotarian, so I had to hide there. I'm wearing my pin with pride. The Rotary was having an event, and we had an insurance company who was there. And a young lady who was there, she said to me, but Lisa, I wish I could. She said, she's talking about her salary on a monthly basis and how much she gets, and then when she gets her bonuses and how much is deducted from her bonuses and what she wished she could take home and what she wished she could pay less in taxes. Another person, also from the same insurance company who was there, I didn't even get an answer. Another person answered, and she said this, my son was sick recently. I had to take him to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. I had to take him to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and he had to get emergency surgery. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital, both from start to finish. Then I left the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital discharged me, and I left. I did not pay a cent. I did not pay a cent for his care. I did not pay a cent for his surgery. I did not pay a cent for his medication. I didn't pay a cent for his bed. I didn't pay a cent for his meals, and he was special needs, and he had special meals. I didn't pay a cent. I left with a $0 balance. And she said it was in that moment that I realized where my taxes go. That's what she said to me. And I respected that because there is a culture that because we don't pay at the point of service delivery, it is free. It is not free. It costs something. The money comes from somewhere. And if I, as the minister responsible for business, do not get business facilitation right, the $470 million that comes from corporation tax that can cover our health care bill at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital that will benefit Barbadians who cannot afford to pay is at risk. This is important. This is how it connects to Barbadians. So the legislation is benign. The legislation is there. It talks about the board. It talks about who reports to whom. That's fine. But then when we start to connect what we do in estimates and we look at sectoral ministries and what is happening on the ground, we connect it to average Barbadian lives, and then all of a sudden we connect it to this highfalutin conversation on business facilitation, business support organizations, and corporation tax. Let us understand that the money that we pay in services is a zero balance because the government invests in initiatives like this one. If Barbados does not get business facilitation right, and companies choose to go to other jurisdictions where they can take less time to do the same things in Barbados, that revenue coming from corporation tax is at risk. And with it, our ability to fix roads, our ability to pay for health services, our ability to support small businesses, our ability to support financial literacy, our ability to invest in education and fix schools and start it earlier in the summer, and all the things that people want the government to do but don't have a price tag associated with. It comes from the productive sectors when we are able to earn money for this country, because the government does not trade. The government doesn't do business. The government is a facilitator. And one of the most important things that we have to be able to do is to facilitate business. But I'll tell you something further, Madam President. Of that $470 million in corporation tax, $70 million of that came from local businesses. So small businesses matter. Small businesses matter. So while it is important for us, we may have in this process, in business facilitation, a corporate trust service provider who is a member of the Barbados International Business Association. They may come in, usually they're attorneys, they may come in with a box. Their clerks may come in with a box of 100 documents to file. Sometimes they have more than 100 documents to file. And they're standing in the same queue, Madam President, as the small business sole proprietor who is just there to do one transaction or ask a question. It can't happen, Mr. President, because we have to be able to function and cater for businesses both large and small. And it is for that reason, Madam President, that we have created one within Business Barbados, a business advisory support service that allows small businesses to have the benefit of a person who is there front of the office to deal with their queries, to answer questions, to guide them, and to ensure that they're able to navigate their way through what we know to be sometimes a complicated system. Because we're not putting these measures in place just because, as I've outlined, there are 33 pieces of legislation, direct and indirectly responsible, well, underneath this entity. So anything that they're doing is a legislative responsibility. But Ms. Bradford on the Pike Corner bus, who has a company, a small business, a small shop, what does she know about and has been immersed in something like the Companies Act? Do we require it of her either? No, not this government, not this administration, and not this ministry. So what are we doing? A business support advisory services will be created under Business Barbados to be able to guide small businesses through the process of navigating, setting up a business, reapplying on an annual basis depending on what is necessary, submitting annual returns, whatever you need, you now will have a dedicated support mechanism for small businesses. In addition to that, Madam President, what we have also done is to look at how the office historically has been structured. You would have an officer who, and I'm being very honest, an officer who may have come from the Ministry of Transport and Works today, and them don't know nothing but business on any given day, because that's not, it's central government. So in central government, you're subject to transfer, right? So you put an officer who came from the Ministry of Transport and Works, and all of a sudden they're right there. But they're as out of their depth as the person who was coming in to see them. So Business Barbados now separates the company from central government so that you're able to, one, attract the skills that you need, retain and train the skills that you require, and to be able to function independently of central government. It will stand outside of the central government apparatus deliberately because this is highly specialized and it's business focused. Additionally, we also have set up, for the first time, we brought in a dedicated human resource team, and I want to recognize the Barbados Employers Confederation and also Dr. Karen Best, who has come in as the industrial relations and as the HR consultant on the team. She too is part of the team. And so what we have set up, Madam President, is a front office which existed before, a middle office which did not exist before, and a back office. So once upon a time, everybody had to call the registrar of KIPO to get anything done, or the deputy registrar. No more. There will now be what we call an outbound customer service team, where in the same way that the Barbados Revenue Authority, Madam President, on an annual basis If there's anybody in the country who does not know when it's time to file income tax, when it's time to pay land tax, you know, because there's all of this communication coming out in the public domain. You are oftentimes getting emails. The outbound customer service team of Business Barbados will now do that, especially for small businesses, so that people who would not have known how to navigate the system before will now automatically get an email shot out to them where they're being told, it's almost time for filing. It's almost time to submit your annual returns, and the business advisory support team internal to Business Barbados will do that work along with them, will assist and guide them through the process. The middle office team also has now been structured, and they will be there to make sure that we can improve turnaround times and be in a position to deliver in the way that the business community and that the public of Barbados expects of us. There's another element that has been new that did not exist before. An anomaly that existed since 2013, well, since the beginning of time actually, was the fact that the registrar of CAIPO was both the registrar with responsibility for companies and the registrar with responsibility for intellectual property. Two very different disciplines, two very different areas. We have now, under this legislation, and you will see it in the actual draft of the legislation, separated out intellectual property from companies. There will now be a standalone intellectual property agency housed within Business Barbados that will be focused exclusively on matters relating to intellectual property. And I want to express my appreciation to the World Intellectual Property Organization based in Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland, for being here on the ground with us a few weeks ago for 2 weeks and ensuring that the work of the Intellectual Property Agency Barbados is now, for the first time, on the latest WIPO platform. And we are now going to be rolling this out once Business Barbados gets So we have deliberately gone through, I call it getting into the weeds. So, you know, sometimes we develop policy and we stay at a high level, but we don't think about how it's actually going to be implemented. By putting together this exceptionally gifted transformation team, they have literally gone through and thought of everything that we could think. But we didn't stop there. We didn't stop there. We then went through, Madam President, to ensure that when we construct a board, and the board is set up also in the legislation in section 8. We established the board. We've established a board to ensure that you have the same parties who are part of the design overseeing the implementation. So you now have the Chamber of Commerce who will sit on the board, the Small Business Association to sit on the board, the Barbados International Business Association sitting on the board, and then a number of individuals who are private sector oriented and consumer oriented, but business oriented, sitting on the board to be in a position to support the rollout of Business Barbados. How is this also meant to interact with other state entities? We have already, Madam President, met with the Barbados Revenue Authority. We have already integrated the digital team from Business Barbados with the digital team from the Barbados Revenue Authority, notwithstanding the current challenges that they may be facing, but the expectation is that we want to make things easier for Barbadians. If I was not in government, I may not know some of the things that are required and where to go and to find them. And we have to make it easier for Barbadians to navigate their way around the systems. And so the intention here is to have a single entry where once you come into the Business Barbados space, it allows you to connect to all of the other services of government that may be ancillary or related to you doing business. The National Insurance Scheme, the Barbados Revenue Authority, Customs and Excise Department, Immigration Department. And so the platforms that we will be rolling out and introducing over the coming year will be those systems that are interoperable and allow for us to be able to build on a modular platform and then be able to integrate other services as they evolve. But we also know that in as much as it may be future forward today, Madam President, in 2024, times change. CAIPO itself as an entity has said that to us loud and clear. The way in which KIPO may have been set up, the way in which KIPO evolved, is not what KIPO needs to be now. So are we creating institutions that are dynamic now but static in another week? Because as other jurisdictions focus on their own competitiveness, their own facilitation support, they're making changes. So the intention is to ensure that the transition team becomes a transformation team and allows us to constantly be innovating around the changes that are going to be necessary as time evolves. So inbuilt into this is a mitigation that allows for us to be able to evolve over time. Now, I want also to thank the National Union of Public Workers. We shared the draft of the legislation with them in June of this year, and we want to thank them for not just reviewing the legislation, but meeting with us and sharing their views. They had the opportunity to share changes that they wanted to make. Those changes were incorporated, and the text that you have before us is reflective of the changes made by both the Labor Department, or I should say the changes, but the comments and the inputs from the Ministry of Labor with responsibility for labor overall, as well as the National Union of Public Workers. And as we move forward through the process to look at things like terms and conditions, not terms and conditions because they're meant to be no less favorable than those which persons currently function under. So the expectation is that offer letters and term sheets and those kinds of things will be exchanged in full collaboration with the union under the leadership of our Industrial Relations and Human Resource Consultant, Dr. Karen Best, who has guided us this far through the process. Now, the KIPO has a couple of things that it deals with at this point in terms of filings and transitional authorities, and we have made sure to build in, or rather to inbuild, the transition provisions for KIPO under the Business Barbados legislation, and so that will continue over time. We also, Madam President, started to think about the how we roll out. KIPO, as it stands now, where it is located, companies and the IP department, they don't have enough capacity to be able to allow them to do the things that we are talking about now. So the expectation is that within the next 6 to 8 months, there is a new building that has already been identified, and it is going to be in a position to make the officers at KIPO far more comfortable and the public that they serve far more comfortable. And so the expectation is that you will see a location change in the next 6 to 8 months of Business Barbados, and we're looking forward to rolling that out. I want to close, or wind to a close, I should say, Madam President, by speaking about the staff. In as much as I received complaint after complaint after complaint about KIPO, people must matter. People must matter. And when we talk about abuse, I learned many years ago, sometimes when I go into a store, sometimes when I get to a cash register, something may trouble me. But the person who is usually standing behind that cash register usually has not made any decisions on the things that trouble me. They are the frontline staff. They are battling just as much as I am a lot of times because they are getting it repeatedly from clients and customers every day. The staff at KIPO that I am extremely honored to lead, they have been as frustrated as the business community has been about the challenges that they're facing. We've become this society that only thinks about what we want. We've become this society that only worries about how things affect us. I have been in meetings on KIPO where I remember getting really upset one day. I'm being honest. I remember getting really upset one day when I was talking about the existing corporate digital registry and the challenges that were being experienced with that. And I shared with the person that I had officers who were so frustrated, so overwhelmed, that they were looking to even leave not just KIPO, but the government service overall because they were completely fed up. I shared with them how it affected them. I shared with them, even in some instances, how they had started to pull on their hair, sections of their hair, because they were so frustrated. When I was finished sharing what was happening on the KIPO side, the person stood up and said to me, I don't think they stood up, yeah, I hear all of that, but I still want. That's very Barbadian these days. We want what we want. We don't care about nobody else. Here is an officer who is struggling. Their mental health is impacted because we have put additional responsibility and additional responsibility and additional responsibility, non-functioning systems in some instances, malfunctioning systems in other instances, and we expect them to function at optimum capacity, and the person standing in front of them could not care less how they feel. I just want what I want. Barbados as a culture has to evolve beyond that. It is a problem. We mistreat people and we do damage to people because of it. It is a selfish way of being. And it has created, in some instances, an unfortunate and adversarial relationship between business and government, because there often becomes a perception that the business community don't care about people, they just want what they want. I have had the opportunity to work with enough people in the business community to know that that is not everybody, that is not always representative of the business community. There are those who are, yes, who they are. And they're not as selfish in dealing with one entity. They want what they want, period. But for the majority and for the most part, that has not been my experience. People have been willing to engage, people have been willing to be considerate. But yes, there are frustrations on both sides. And I want to recognize those challenges on the part of KIPO. We have had a corporate digital registry that was launched in 2021, and it has had its share of problems. It has had its share of problems because in some instances, the system didn't even accept proper names, including with inverted commas. It didn't allow for changes. You would put the information in, and all of a sudden it vanishes, and you're going to start all over again. We had any number of issues, and it is for that reason that we brought in a digital auditor to be able to look at the system and make recommendations. Before I came in here this morning, we had the international team that previously designed the 2021 system. They came here and they met with us because we wanted to make sure we can close that chapter tightly and be in a position to move to a platform that is fit for purpose in the shortest possible time frame. So the system frustrated both users and administrators. And so I want to commend them that even under the most difficult of circumstances, and despite the business community and their frustrations, they have soldiered on. So how do we now take the structure that we have had and transition it into Business Barbados? The team that was at KIPO will come into Business Barbados if they so opt to do, or they will opt to stay in central government. It is their choice. There are no persons who are being sent home from KIPO to create Business Barbados. Persons will have the option of either staying in central government in a role that is appropriate to their skills and their appropriate level, or accepting an offer letter to come over into Business Barbados. Persons who currently work in KIPO and want to come over and be a part of the transformation that will be Business Barbados have been given the opportunity to do so. They have been given the opportunity to do so in legislation on terms no less favorable than those that they are currently working under. In fact, we have agreed that the same model that has been used with, in particular, most recently, the National Insurance Scheme transformation, where the terms are more favorable, that they have the option of so doing. If they decide that they do not want to come over to Business Barbados, they can opt not to go home and look for a new job because they're public officers, but they can opt to remain in central government. So the expectation is there will be a seamless, people-centered transition over to Business Barbados, and people will not be disadvantaged. We are not sending people home for Business Barbados. I want to make that clear. When they come over to Business Barbados, however, and I have outlined a whole heap of very lofty and transformational ideas in my presentation, and over time you will hear more. But you can't give a man a basket to carry water, right? You have to give people the tools. So I want to recognize the Barbados Employers Confederation and Dr. Karen Best for working with us in developing training, capacity building, employee improvement plans, performance metrics, incentive structures that allow people to focus on the things that need to be focused on. We've just agreed over the course of the last 2 days that the officers also need to have an opportunity to be interfacing on the user side, because if you are designing something and you are just an administrator or a regulator and not a user, then you're going to design it for your purpose, but you're not thinking about the end user. So the officers in Business Barbados will equally be required to be immersed on the user side of the platform. So they're thinking about the people that they're serving, how the people they're serving are interfacing with the system that they're working in. And so all of that is now being done. And I have every confidence that the team that we have engaged over the last year and a half, who has helped to design this process, the team that we have engaged for the last year and a half that we have allowed to give ideas, recommendations, what are the things that they see, what are the things that they imagine they need. These are real life people that they will have the skills and the tools and the capacity building and the exposure that they require. One of the first things that we expect to do, Madam President, is to also begin the process of recruiting. KIPO will go over the first 3 years to a 50% increase in manpower resources, of course trained. In the second year, a 75% increase in manpower resources. And in the third year, 100% increase in manpower resources. You can't carry water in a basket. So not only are we training up the existing staff, but we are adding bodies to ensure that we have the ability to deliver what we say we want to do. So I am certain that there are any number of things that will come up during the course of today's discussion. I'm going to share any responses, of course, in my responses, but suffice to say that so far, in addition to what I have just described, we have an ongoing project to deal with the backlog. So there were backlogs for things like bills of sale. Those things have now been brought up to speed. I think we have a few more remaining now, but between 2022 and now, we brought the bills of sale up to speed. We also are working through communication on matters relating to annual returns. And finally, we are also going to be ensuring that we can tidy up the registry as it is, because garbage in, garbage out. We've had instances where sometimes, and I'm going to make the appeal, if you are filing and you are making errors in the system, part of the delay is also going to be caused by those errors. And we are going to be encouraging people to ensure that when they submit information, that it is accurate at first pass. And if not, rather than letting the system take the information incorrectly, leaving it there for how many ever days or weeks before it comes back to you to say that it is incorrect, just like if you were to go to a U.S. Embassy online and you were applying for a visa or something like that, if the information is not accurate, you can't submit it. If things are missing, you can't submit it, and it will tell you what is missing. So we are now working through that very system to ensure that people are able to submit upfront and do so correctly. And the backlog is being worked on simultaneously, and the backlog team is working in parallel to make sure that by the time Business Barbados is fully operationalized, that we will then be in a position to deliver on the objectives that the company has set for itself, but more importantly, Madam President, the objectives that I have outlined that benefit the country, attraction of business in collaboration with Invest Barbados, supporting small businesses in the same way we support large businesses, ensuring that we're able to get Barbados positioned as a corporation tax hub, where we are attracting businesses to domicile here and able to generate the revenue that we can go to support our education, our healthcare, our social services by that revenue, and that ultimately Barbados begins to be seen as that global exemplar, Madam President, for business facilitation, because not just because we've said we are, but because we're doing it, Madam President. And with these words, I am obliged to beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.